Want to live in your dream suburb and own a property? Well, Rentvesting lets you do both. It's all about renting where you love and investing where you can afford. In this episode, we're going to talk about how it works and why it can be a game changer, especially for first home buyers like you and me. This is my dad, John. He's a mortgage broker and a property investor. Dad's always big on, I'll give you knowledge, not money.
Thank you, Nicola. That's right. So my aim is to give you as much knowledge as possible to be able to buy your property rather than actually give you money to help you buy a property. Because I think with that knowledge, you get a lot further in life than if I was just to give you money.
So what exactly is rentvesting and how does it work?
Rentvesting is something where you can actually rent a property in an area where you would like to live, and generally rent in an area where the yields are quite low. What that means is, for example, you might rent a good property in an area where the yield might be only like 2%. For example, in eastern suburbs, South Australia.
What does yield mean?
Yield is the rent return on that property. For example, if you've got a $1.5 million property, rent might only be $800 a week. The yield is quite low. So the return on that investment is quite low.
For the purchase price or
for the value of that property. So your aim would be to try to find a property which has got good rent or low rent for a high value property. So it's a good house, which you probably couldn't afford to buy, but you can afford to live there if you rent it.
Mm-hmm.
So rent investing is basically renting in an area where you can't afford to live in. You're renting a property that is valued quite well for rental. So not a good investment property for somebody else, but it's a good property for you to rent. And then invest in an area where you're going to get a good yield and good return on your investment. For example, you might buy a property for $600,000-$700,000 where you're getting a good return, and rent a property worth, say, $1 to $1.5 million where the return's quite low.
Yeah.
So you're getting the best of both worlds, where you're investing in the property market but living in an area where you want to live in.
And you'd get the best return when you're investing when you're either by the sea or near the city.
Yeah, correct. So from our last episode with Peter Kefalianos, that was his tips, where you buy either close to the city or close to the beach, and that's where you're going to have the most capital growth. And at the same time, you're probably going to get good yields in those areas as well.
So why is rentvesting becoming so popular for young buyers?
Like I've just said, it allows you to live in a location where you want to live in and still invest in an area where you're going to get good capital growth. And that might mean you might not just invest in South Australia, you might buy interstate where property prices might be increasing more than what they are here. So it allows you to invest anywhere in the country and live where you want to live.
Yep.
The other benefit of rent investing as well, so by having an investment property rather than having a loan on your own occupied property, there's tax benefits, there's benefits for capital growth. You can actually borrow more money as well, because if you're buying a house to live in, you're not receiving any rent. So what the bank will lend you would be lower than if you were to buy a house as an investment property and rent that property out.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And the other benefit is that loan that you have against that investment property is tax deductible. So then with that rental income and the tax deductibility against that investment property, that increases your borrowing capacity. So you can potentially borrow more as an investment property than you would buying a house to live in.
What do you actually mean by the income, the rental income?
So for example, if you're working and you're earning $70,000 a year and you're renting out a property that's getting $25,000 a year, your income is $95,000 in total. So you've then got $95,000 available income to go towards servicing the loan. So when you are renting though, there is an expense for you to rent. If you're still single, you probably generally still rent with a friend. So the rent that you will pay, let's say the rent for the property is $800 a week, you're probably only going to be paying $400 a week rent on that house you're living in. So the cost would be lower as opposed to the rent that you'll be receiving on that investment property. And the benefit of having an investment property, tax deduction, and higher borrowing capacity gets you into a better property as opposed to buying a house to live in. More chance of capital growth.
Mm-hmm.
So in summary, Nicola, rent investing is investing in an area where you know you're going to have good capital growth and good rental yields, good rental returns, which means that you're going to get a good rental amount per year for the value of that property.
Yeah.
You're then going to have the tenant paying off your mortgage, but what you're doing though, you're paying rent to somebody else in an area where you want to live in. And that property that you generally rent would be a better value property than what you could afford to buy in. So you're living in a better house, but still investing in the property market, having somebody else pay off your mortgage.
Okay. So who would you say rentvesting is actually suited for?
I'd probably say for young professionals looking to get into the property market that want to live in an area that's close to their work, close to the city, or even close to the beach, but they can't afford to buy a house in that area. So by renting in an area where they want to live in, they can then still invest and still be in the property market, but buy a property in an area where they know they're going to get some potential capital growth.
Yep.
And have somebody else rent that property with good rent returns and having them pay off their mortgage. This is also good for first home buyers as well, because you can actually borrow more money buying an investment property than you can buying a house to live in. So by buying your first property as an investment, you're buying a better quality asset, which means more opportunity for capital growth, better rent return, and better long-term benefits. There are a few things that you need to consider for the first homeowners grant, but it can work out better. For example, you can still buy your investment property, not live in that property, 2 years' time buy another property to live in, and so let's just say in South Australia it is a new property, and not pay any stamp duty and still get the first homeowners grant.
Yeah. Okay.
So you can still take advantage of the grants available by having your first property as an investment that you've never lived in, and buy your first house to live in and still get the benefits on that second house, being stamp duty and first homeowners grant. But things like this change all the time, and it's very important to check this with your broker. The other real benefit of this as well, Nicola, is you can diversify your portfolio. So you can have properties in multiple locations, even multiple cities. So you might invest in an area in Victoria where you know there's going to be potential for capital growth, or you might invest in Perth where there's been a huge growth in the property market over there.
Yeah.
We're quite lucky in South Australia at the moment. We've had some very good property growth here, but that might not be the case in 5 years' time. So you can diversify your investments in any state around Australia and really understand the market and benefit from those capital growth.
So how would you choose the right property for rent vesting?
So you'll do your research, and like on your previous episode with Peter Kalizos, land, location and looks. So understanding that the location is important, and looking for areas where you see potential for capital growth, and also look for locations where the rental yields are quite good and you're going to get a good return on your investment as well.
So it always comes back to land, location and looks.
Yep. So looking for a property that has that right rental yield, rental return. So you don't want to buy a property that, for example, is $600,000 that is getting $300 a week rent, because that's quite a bad rental return. If you're buying a $600,000 property, you want to try to get a property that's getting rented for between $500 and $600 a week. It could also be a property that you can add value to.
Yeah.
So if you were to look at a property that needed a new kitchen, you could potentially buy a house, add value to it, increase the rent, and get a good rental return on that property.
So just always looking for ways to appreciate your property.
Correct, yeah. So always look at ways you can improve that property to get a better rent return and add value.
Keeping in mind you want to add value to the property, what are some financial benefits and challenges you might experience with rent vesting?
So the benefits are that you can build wealth while still maintaining the lifestyle that you want. So what I mean by that is you can have your money invested in the property market in different areas and still live in an area where you want to live and have that lifestyle you want to have. The other benefit is by having investment properties, there's potential for tax deductions. So when you're buying a property, there's generally depreciation benefits, there's interest expenses, there's other property costs as well. So although there might be a neutral cash flow benefit,
It'll be tax
there might
deductible.
be tax deductions which give you a rebate when you do your tax returns. So there are benefits in holding investment properties and benefiting from some tax deductions as well. So the other benefits are there's lower entry costs. So you can buy an investment property at a lower cost and live in an area with a property valued a lot higher. So you can rent a property valued a lot higher with better lifestyle benefits, but get an investment property at a lower cost. So for example, you might not be able to afford to buy a house in, say, Burnside, where you might want to live, which is close to CBD, but you might be able to afford to buy an investment property down south or far north, where you won't want to live, but you're going to get good rental returns and good capital growth. So there are still some challenges when you are going this way, and you still need to have a very tight budget as well, because you are still renting and you're paying rental expense. Hopefully at this stage you're renting with somebody else so you can share the rental costs and the property costs there. So you still need to be quite strict with your expenses. And I would also say still have a buffer available to you, because if that house is vacant, you still need to be able to cover those mortgage repayments. So if it's not rented out for a period of a month, you still need to make sure you can still cover your mortgage. So there are some emotional trade-offs when you are renting. For example, if you are renting a house, you can't do the changes to that house that you want to do. For example, you can't go and change your kitchen, or you can't repaint the inside of that house the way you want to live, the way you want to make it. Or if you're a young family, you can't go and measure the height of your kids on the door and draw it up, because it's not your house, you're still renting. That's the disadvantage of renting. So you are limited on what you can do to that house, as opposed to having a house that you're living in that you actually own.
It doesn't sound too challenging. So what would be the first steps to rent vesting?
So the first step would be, first of all, go back to your situation and what you can afford to borrow and what the bank will lend you. So know what your borrowing capacity is and know what property you can afford. So understanding, speaking to your broker, working out what deposit you have, what you can afford to buy as an investment property whilst you're still renting. So that's probably the first step, is knowing what your budget is and what you can afford to buy. Have a clear financial goal. So you might have a 10-year plan where you're going to be running this rent investing and renting in a house and buying investment properties. And then you might decide, let's say you might be able to buy 3 properties over a 10-year period. You might say, well, let's sell 2 in 10 years' time, end up with 1 investment property, but then use those profits to buy a house to live in. So have a clear goal in place as to how long you will do this for, so know what your plans are in the future.
So I don't actually think it's that good. Like, you're double dipping. You have to go buy a house for someone then to pay you rent, and then you have to pay rent to someone else to live in the area you want to. Why wouldn't you just pick one?
It's back to what you can afford. So you look at what you can afford to buy for a house to live in, as opposed to what you can afford to buy for a house as an investment. So if you're looking at yourself and what you can afford to buy for a house to live in, you're very limited on what you could potentially buy, and it's probably not going to be in an area where you would like to live. Whereas you could rent somewhere where you want to live and buy investment property anywhere in the country, and still have the benefits of that capital growth. Now, I know you're saying, I know what you're thinking. Well, living at home still might be an option for you, but not for everybody.
Yeah, so if it's not an option, then it would be good.
Some people have to rent, and they might be renting with 2-3 other people in a house to keep their costs down as well.
Yeah.
And I know what you're thinking, why should I pay someone rent and then have another house then paying me rent? But the benefits are quite huge, because there's tax benefits, there's capital growth, but it's also back to that lifestyle benefit as well of you living where you want to live in, a house where you want to live. And you'll get a better quality house in a better area for a lower cost, as opposed to if you had to buy that house in that area.
I'm still not convinced. It sounds like more expense.
Okay, so let's break this down. Let's say you want to live in a house that's worth $1 million. You've got a deposit of $150,000 because you need to cover stamp duty as well. Your loan would then be $900,000. So you've got a loan of $900,000.
That's for buying.
That's for buying a house for $1 million, okay? So your repayments on that would be around $1,300 per week. Plus you've then got to pay your council rates, your maintenance, your emergency service levy fees, which is probably another $200 a week as well. So your costs of that house with a $900,000 mortgage is about $1,500 per week, and none of it is tax deductible.
Okay.
Now, if you were to rent that property, I'd probably say you'd be able to rent a $1 million property for around $700 to $800 per week. So that's a difference between, say, $1,500 per week and $800 per week. So you're living in a $1 million property for a lot less. On top of the rent, though, you're not having to pay any council rates. You're not having to pay emergency service levy. And the best thing is you probably don't have to pay for any maintenance of that property either. So you're living in a better property by renting it, but what you're doing is diversifying your investment portfolio to anywhere in Australia in an area where you're going to get good capital growth and still living the lifestyle that you want to live in.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So the key here, though, is not just rent. The key is to rent and buy an investment property, especially if you're not in a situation where you can still live with your parents. So if you're renting and you buy an investment property, then there are a lot of benefits by doing that, because that loan's not tax deductible in the house you're living in.
Yeah.
It is tax deductible in the investment. You're getting somebody else to pay your mortgage off, and you're getting capital growth, and your money is working for you.
Okay, that makes sense.
So let's compare this to buying an investment property using your $150,000 deposit. So if you were to buy an investment property for $600,000, you'd need, say, $630,000 to cover stamp duty costs. Minus your $150,000 makes it a loan of about $480,000. So if you were to borrow the money as principal and interest, so paying that loan off, your repayments would be around that $670 per week. So on that property for $600,000, your rent's probably going to be around that $600 a week, if not better if you're buying well and getting a better yield. So then you're paying that loan off, but you're only having to cover an extra $70 on top of your mortgage. But you do have your other costs of council rates, etc., on top of that as well. So you can see the cash flow benefit. You're only putting a little bit of extra money onto that investment property, as opposed to a lot more in the difference on buying a house to live in, which is about $750 difference. So there's a lot of benefit there. So you get the lifestyle, but you're still investing. And then on top of that, there will be tax benefits too. So when you do your tax returns, you're probably going to get some money back as well.
Yeah. So that makes sense to me now.
Okay, good.
So my takeaway from this episode would be that rent money is not always dead money, but you have to be investing for it to work. Plus, it sounds like this could give me a lifestyle I might not have been able to afford for my first home.
Yep, very good, Nicola. And it's also something that's not forever. So although you're renting initially, if you set yourself a goal, you eventually will be able to afford the house that you want to live in.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, guys, for listening. I hope you've gotten a lot from this. And my name's Nicola Kefalianos, and this is my dad, John. We'll see you next week.